Fredericksburg by Mark Nesbitt. The Battle of Fredericksburg illustrated decisively the futility of military tactics of the past and the innovation and horror of military tactics to come. It showed the importance of logistics and planning, and how the blunderings of an awkward military bureaucracy can bog down a campaign and decide weeks before the fighting the outcome of the battle. It also displayed once again the indomitable courage of the American soldier. On November 7th, 1862, the command of the Federal Army of the Potomac was transferred from Major General George B. McClellan to Major General Ambrose E. Burnside. Within 3 days, the new Union commander presented a plan of battle to the government. The whole plan depended upon Burnside getting his army of 120,000 men quickly across the Rappahannock River at Fredericksburg in order to strike south towards Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy. Since Confederates had burned all the bridges across the Rappahannock, Burnside needed portable pontoon bridges to arrive at Fredericksburg precisely when his army did, before Robert E. Lee and his Confederates discovered the Federals' intentions and opposed the crossing. The first of the Federals' grand divisions arrived across the Rappahannock from Fredericksburg in the afternoon of November 17th. The pontoon bridges, however, had not. Lee was now tipped off as to where the Yankees were headed and began to concentrate his army, which would eventually number 78,000 at Fredericksburg. The bridges finally arrived November 25th. Shortly after moonset, around 1 a.m. on December 11th, engineers from the Army of the Potomac began dragging the cumbersome pontoon boats down the slope from Chatham, the 18th century mansion on Stafford Heights. At the cover of darkness and fog on the river, the engineers got the bridges built about halfway across. Brigadier General William Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade waited in rifle pits and riverfront dwellings in Fredericksburg and listened to the sounds of construction echoing through the misty night. Barksdale had determined to delay the Federals' crossing for as long as he could so that Lee could gather his forces together. Out in the middle of the river, on the unfurnished bridges, the unarmed engineers and construction troops heard the bell in the clock tower of St. George's Episcopal Church, one of the landmarks of the Fredericksburg skyline, toll at 5 a.m. Through the rising mist, one of the Federal officers saw a line of human arms flailing up and down, the unmistakable motion of men ramming home charges in muzzle-loading weapons. A few minutes later, an engineer on the end of one of the bridges heard an ominous shout through the fog. Fire! And suddenly bullets ripped into the wood and into the bridges and tore through the flesh of men. Union soldiers collapsed upon the unfinished bridges or tumbled helplessly into the icy river, weighted down by their heavy greatcoats. Those who could fled back in panic to the shore, but there was no safety there. For the rifled muskets of the Civil War, the opposite bank of the Rappahannock was easily within range, and men, mules, and horses went down. The same thing was happening across from the old city boat landings. Confederates rushed down the old ferry access, Rocky Lane, to the end of the docks and fired into the engineers on the bridges, already 2/3 across. Work on that bridge ended as the Federals ran for their lives back to the opposite riverbank. The Union commanders decided that the Confederates must be routed by artillery and began a bombardment of the town. By 10 a.m., 183 Northern cannons were firing and Fredericksburg was being blasted to pieces. When the gunners were satisfied that they had done their job, the engineers returned to the bridges. Just as they began to work, the Mississippians emerged from the rubble and started picking them off again. This sequence repeated itself several times throughout the morning. Meantime, although another bridge a mile downstream at the lower crossing was completed, Burnside refused to allow his troops to cross until the upstream bridges were completed. He feared they would be isolated without support and cut to pieces. At the upper and middle crossings, work was still stymied by the pesky rebel sharpshooters. At 12:30 p.m., Burnside ordered all available Union cannons to fire on the town, and for an hour, they again pulverized Fredericksburg. In all, some 8,000 shells rained down upon the city. Brick buildings suffered, but the shells merely passed through the wooden structures, leaving holes that occupying Confederates used to fire through. Sophia Street, closest to the river, looked like it had been plowed, and virtually every window in the city had been broken out. Burnside's detailed plans, established some 5 weeks before, were crumbling before his very eyes, with his entire army held up by a handful of obstinate rebel riflemen. At that moment, Brigadier General Henry Hunt, Burnside's artillery chief, passed on an idea that one of the engineers had suggested: ferry a few infantrymen across in pontoons to drive the persistent Confederates back away from the river so the engineers could finish the bridges. Burnside hesitated. Something like that had never been done before in the history of the U.S. Army. Could it be successful, or would Burnside be merely sentencing the men to their own execution in the middle of the river? Burnside wanted only volunteers. Colonel Norman J. Halls, 7th Michigan, when asked if they would cross the river in boats to drive out the enemy, responded with 3 cheers. The waterborne assault was preceded by a massive artillery bombardment beginning at 3 p.m. When the fire slackened, the boats shoved off. At 3:30, the big guns fell silent, and the assault troops of the 7th Michigan rushed to the boats. They had scarcely loaded when the Confederates opened on them again, under orders not to return fire but to concentrate on paddling or pulling across. The men were helpless. The boats took terrible fire until they were 2/3 of the way across. Then a curious thing happened. The Confederate fire slowed to a trickle. The steep river bank below Sophia Street hid the assault craft from the Confederates, and the actual landing was made in relative safety. But the worst was yet to come. The landing party rushed up the slope to Sophia Street and began surrounding the houses where the rebels hid. They had been given the order of no quarter, or to take no prisoners. While some disobeyed the orders, others rushed into houses and shot or bayoneted every man inside. In less than half an hour, Sophia Street was cleared. The Confederates were not about to retire without a fight, and the battle took on a character that would become the bloody hallmark of wars of the next century and a half. A new type of tactical fighting needed to be learned by warriors. House to house, urban street fighting. And it began in Fredericksburg. Confederates defended the town from the alleys and backyards behind Sophia Street. By occupying the Southern troops, the 7th Michigan was buying time for the engineers to complete the bridges. Massachusetts troops were ferried across to bolster the Wolverines. And as the bridges were completed, they were ordered to advance beyond the waterfront and push the rebels out of the town to make room for more Union soldiers to land via the bridges. As Federals muscled their way up Hawk Street, taking awful casualties at the intersection of Hawk and Caroline, the 20th Massachusetts lost 97 men in and around the intersection. Night fell early in December, and still the fighting went on. Backyards became battlegrounds, and dooryards death traps. One Federal broke into a second-floor room and was shot through the window by a Confederate across the street. The fighting was illuminated by musket flashes. Men were wounded by splinters flying from brick chimneys and wooden framing. The horror of not knowing from which window or doorway the next shot would come was demoralizing. Finally, with the groans of the wounded echoing through the darkened streets, the lack of light brought on an end to the carnage. By 7 p.m., most of the firing had died down, and Confederates began retreating from the town. With the Confederate resistance in the city of Fredericksburg quelled, December 12th was spent by Union forces crossing the Rappahannock into the city. Burnside ordered his chief signal officer to run a telegraph line from occupied Fredericksburg across both the lower and upper pontoon bridges, then to connect his headquarters with the far left flank of the enemy. The communicating device was a clever magnetic pointer system. Dial a letter on the sending device, and the pointer spins to the same letter on the receiver. It was claimed to be the first time the magnetic telegraph was used on the battlefield. It would not be the last. Federals drained 5 feet of freezing water from a canal between them and Mary's Heights, a ridge west of the city. They also began looting. Wanton destruction began in what had once been one of the finer cities of the South. Private homes were vandalized, libraries sacked, fine arts destroyed, personal treasures stolen, and businesses ransacked beyond anything that had happened in the war previously. 19th century war was not supposed to be waged upon civilians. Fredericksburg changed all of that. Federal assaults were planned for dawn on December 13, 1862. Northern forces under Major General William B. Franklin, one of Burnside's 3 grand divisions, were to launch the attacks from the old Smithfield plantation east of the Bowling Green Road, across the Fredericksburg and Potomac Railroad to strike the Confederates under Stonewall Jackson near Prospect Hill. Franklin used Major General George G. Meade's division and Brigadier General John Gibbon's division, totaling about 8,500 men for the assault. The morning dawned, opaque and misty. The Union assault, which was to get off early, had been delayed. It was nearly 10 a.m. when the fog began to rise. Like ghosts, the Federal troops moved out of the haze, crossed the Bowling Green Road, and headed toward the railroad. Suddenly there were muffled artillery discharges from their left and rear. Major John Pelham, the 24-year-old commander of Jeb Stuart's horse artillery, had used the fog to gain position and raked the Union line, halting its advance. Ordered to retire from the exposed spot, he refused and fought, suffering serious counter-battery fire from the Federals until his ammunition was gone. Pelham, with 1 gun, had managed to hold up the entire Federal assault for an hour. After Pelham withdrew, Meade continued his advance. Jackson's men waited patiently until the Federals were within 500 yards of the forested hill hiding 14 cannons, and then opened fire. Gaps opened in the Federal ranks, and Union soldiers dropped into whatever depressions they could find near the railroad and in the open fields beyond. Jackson's guns drew fire from Federal artillery, and there ensued an hour-long duel. So many artillery horses were shot down that the rebels renamed the place Dead Horse Hill. When the Confederate fire died down, Meade's men continued their advance and struck a 600-yard gap in Jackson's line that had been inadvertently left unguarded. In their drive through the Confederate line, they ran into a brigade of South Carolinians. Confederate Brigadier General Maxcy Gregg mistook the Yankees for retreating Southerners and withheld his fire. It cost him his life. He was shot in the spine and later died. Though Jackson had left a space in his line, he had arranged his reserves in column. During the breakthrough, he launched them into the fought-out Union spearhead. The massive Confederate counterattack pushed Meade's men all the way back across the railroad and back to the Bowling Green Road. Once the Confederates got in range, they were stopped by the massed Union artillery. Both Federals and Confederates tried additional assaults in the late afternoon, but both failed. The carnage at one point was so terrible, the area was christened the Slaughter Pen. Burnside's overall plan was to wait for success on the southern end of the field. then launch assaults upon the Confederates at Marye's Heights, just to the west of the city of Fredericksburg. Burnside ordered the Grand Division of Major General Edward V. Sumner to advance against James Longstreet's Confederates. Just before noon, Union infantry, lined up, shoulder to shoulder, emerged from the streets of the city and began crossing the open fields between Fredericksburg and Marye's Heights. Almost simultaneously, Confederate artillery from the top of the heights began lobbing shells into their packed ranks. Men remembered seeing arms, hands, legs, and clothing flying into the air above their heads, the hideous result of artillery fire upon massed ranks of infantry. In front of the Union troops lay a mill race, 15 feet across and 5 feet deep, partially filled with freezing water. The only places to cross it were at bridges over 3 streets leading out of town. These quickly became bottlenecks as Confederate skirmishers, upon their retreat, removed the floors of the bridges, leaving just the stringers for hundreds of Union troops to attempt to cross. Once across the mill race, the Northerners had to realign their ranks and push on. The last impediment to the Union assault was a wide open field known as the Fairgrounds, which was swept by Confederate rifle fire from a virtually unseen enemy standing behind a chin-high stone wall in the sunken road. Assault after assault repeated the same horrifying and deadly routine. Some of the surviving Union troops found shelter behind the few fence posts left around the fairgrounds. Others sought relief behind the few buildings in the area. A brick grocery building called Syson's Store, a house, and a wheelwright shop owned by the Stratton family. Men and officers piled up behind these structures like flotsam in the lee of an island during a storm. Throughout the afternoon and into the evening, the futile assaults continued. 15 Federal brigades tried to pierce the Confederate line. Men were cut in two by shells, entrails flying in all directions. They were decapitated and slumped, some still kneeling, headless, clinging to their muskets. Unbelievably, one man was seen running past an advancing column without a head until he stumbled into the mill race. One Confederate saw around the Stratton house that the dead were so thick you could walk on them. Holding their fire only made the slaughter easier for the Confederates. Toward the end, the fallen wounded clutched at the legs of the fresh units, trying to stop their comrades from a certain death. The butcher's bill, as the soldiers called the casualty list, was appalling. In 1 hour full of horror, the Union Army lost 4,000 men. All totaled, Burnside lost 12,600 in killed, wounded, and missing, and with some 8,400 casualties occurring below the stone wall and sunken road. Lee lost about 5,300. Fredericksburg ghosts. Most of the buildings in Fredericksburg were scenes of deadly conflict in the very streets that were fought through. Both armies left dead and wounded strewn along the path visitors now walk in Fredericksburg. Of the hundreds of buildings here during the Civil War years, some 350 remain, many perhaps holding forever the spirits of the slain. Nearly every public building and many private homes were used as hospitals. As well, 400 years of history has resulted in countless, restless, perturbed spirits. From its colonial heritage to the horror of being the focal point of 4 major Civil War battles, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, the Wilderness, and Spotsylvania, Fredericksburg has seen more history and more human tragedy than virtually any other city in America. Between 1862 and 1864, more than 100,000 men and boys became casualties in the fighting in and around the town. Most were brought to Fredericksburg to be operated upon, recover, or perish. The personal civilian calamities and the military terror brought on by the numerous and bloody battles may very well account for the reference to Fredericksburg as the most haunted city per capita in the United States. A haunted house on Caroline Street. On December 11, 1862, after initially fighting a delaying action through the streets of Fredericksburg, the Confederates withdrew to the heights west of the city, there to repulse numerous bloody Union attacks 2 days later. Union troops occupied the town, prying into private pantries, pilfering what they needed, and peering out windows of private homes, looking for the enemy or to avoid their own provost guard. Fast forward to the 20th century. According to a woman whose family has lived in Fredericksburg for well over 100 years, renovation was going on in one of the historic buildings along Caroline Street near William Street. The new owner had spent all day tearing up old carpeting. He had finished for the day and rolled it up and placed it in the hall in order to facilitate the workmen removing it the next day. It is well known in paranormal circles that whenever there is a renovation to a historic building, there is more likelihood of paranormal experience occurring. It is almost as if the spirits do not want their routine, their status quo, disturbed. So it was in this case. Trashmen were coming the next afternoon. As he left for the night, the owner told the workmen to remove the rolled-up carpet first thing the next morning and put it by the curb. The next morning, when he arrived at the work site, there was no carpet at the curb. At first he was angry because he knew that their disobedience would cost him time, and in the construction business, time is money. He sought out the foreman and gave him a dressing down. The foreman then took him upstairs to show him why he hadn't removed the carpet. When his men arrived to work in the morning, the carpet was no longer in the hall. He opened the door to the room. There the carpet was, laid down again, with tacks in place. The owner was rightfully concerned and apparently felt immediately that there was something paranormal going on. He called his priest. The priest came in to inspect the area. He walked upstairs to the room. He cautiously opened the door to the room in question and was greeted by the sight of several ghostly Union soldiers across the room, peering out of the windows. The priest left and told the owner that he'd pray for the souls to be on their way. Upon leaving, he said something ominous, spawned perhaps by something else he witnessed in the room, but would not talk about it. He said he would also pray for the owner. Footprints at Caroline Street Cafe. One of the tragedies of the American South before the Civil War was the enforced enslavement of fellow human beings. Even in the South, slavery was considered the peculiar institution. Many Southerners emancipated their slaves long before the war, but others, with large farms to manage, realized that they just couldn't get along without slavery. Fredericksburg was part of the slave-holding South. Of the town's 3,000 inhabitants in 1835, 1,124 were slaves. On the corner of William and Charles Street is the auction block, which was used, among other things, for the display and sale of human beings. It is interesting to imagine that along with the ghosts of tens of thousands of Civil War soldiers who died to either free slaves or maintain a lifestyle that included slavery, that there could also be the spirits of long-dead slaves, still in the bonds of a more ethereal, but still unbreakable kind. People think the ghost stories are relegated to the past. This is not true. This one comes to us from July of 2005. Someone in the Caroline Street Cafe was looking for something. They entered the upstairs room that had been habitually sealed off since it had last been cleaned. Indeed, the person found something, but it was not what she expected. Stretching across the floor were the footprints of a large male. They were bare footprints, and they were etched in white, walking from one side of the abandoned room to the other and back again, as if pacing and waiting for something to happen or someone to come and release the spirit from its centuries-long incarceration. Someone in authority was called and shown the footprints. Well, let's wash them off, was the sentiment. But try as they might, the footprints would not wash off. The room was closed, but inspected frequently after that. Slowly, over a couple of weeks, the footprints faded from sight, returning to an unseen world whence they came. Smythe's cottage. On the corner of Fakir Street and Prince Anne stands a small Civil War-era building that has been used for years as a site of several restaurants. A few years back it was called Smythe's Cottage, and according to the owners, both patrons and employees have experienced unexplainable paranormal phenomena over the years. An employee would go around lighting candles. Returning from the other room, she would see that some had been blown out. Setting tables with the silverware in Smythe's cottage before the customers came in was often frustrating. The silverware was often moved out of place. Both of these activities were known to occur when there was no one else in the room. Those and other seemingly paranormal phenomena are blamed on a woman who the owners call Elizabeth, who is believed to have committed suicide by hanging herself in the stairway leading to the second floor. Elizabeth, according to legend, was a Union sympathizer. With Fredericksburg occupied by Union soldiers during the Civil War, one can only speculate why she would pass important information on to the enemy, although it easily could have been done. It is also rumored that the building during the war was used as a bordello, no doubt by Union troops. Whether Elizabeth was involved in this fraternization with the enemy is unknown, but the rumor is that her husband caught her and accused her of treason toward the South and infidelity to him. The shame was too much and was the apparent reason for her suicide. The children of the owner, when the building was Smythe's cottage, had experiences on the second floor of the house. One, when he was 11 years old, watched as the closet doors began to open by themselves, while he was the only person in the room. Frightened, he ran from the room. His younger brother, at age 9, saw a whitish mist begin to come out of the same closet. More recently, a patron in the back of the restaurant saw a short, heavy-set woman in a long, dark, old-fashioned skirt and white apron move swiftly past his table, as if she had a mission in mind. She went swiftly out into the garden, which was enclosed by a tall wooden fence. Interestingly enough, it was at the same time some ghost hunters were conducting a paranormal investigation. They rushed out after the woman, but by the time the investigators reached the inescapable garden, she had vanished. While the investigators were there, other paranormal events were recorded. In the same room where Elizabeth had been seen, a bowl containing sugar and artificial sweetener crashed to the floor and broke. No one had been in the room when it happened. The investigators caught some odd lights on tape moving in opposite directions, obviously not reflections from car lights, which would move in the same direction over and over as cars passed. And the closet door, which the owner's son had been seen to open before he beat a hasty retreat, was recorded on the tape moving ever so slightly, as if someone were trying to open it. And most ominously, there are the reports from patrons and servers that as they pass the stairways that lead to the second floor, their peripheral vision is disturbed by a swinging motion at the top of the stairs. They look, and for a split second they see a spectral woman floating, as if hanging in midair at the top of the stairs, swaying, and then disappearing. There is a portrait of Union General Ulysses S. Grant that used to hang next to the stairway. In a town that saw so much destruction by the Union armies, in a house that witnessed the destruction of a family by the circumstances of the war, the portrait seems to be a disturbing reminder of all that tragedy. Owners of the building will come into the house in the morning to find the portrait angled. They straighten it and make sure it is still straight at the end of the day when they lock up, and for a few days it stays that way. Then another morning, the image of the man who symbolized so much human agony for the South is tilted again. Finally, one morning, the owners entered the building after straightening the picture when they left the night before. They were shocked and confused to find the picture turned around, facing the wall. St. George's Episcopal Church. Looking at its skyline from across the Rappahannock River, Fredericksburg seems to have an abundance of churches. Sharp steeples break up the horizon, a scene virtually unchanged since Union soldiers saw it from the same spot some 15 decades before. One of the larger churches in the city is St. George's Episcopal Church. It boasts the oldest congregation in Fredericksburg. In 1732, it was George Washington's church when he lived across the river at his boyhood home, Ferry Farm. George's mother, Mary Washington, worshipped in the original church on the site. The present St. George's Episcopal Church, actually the third on this site, was built in 1849. Just outside is a graveyard. The oldest stone is dated 1752, and Colonel John Dandridge, father of Martha Washington, and William Paul, brother of John Paul Jones, are buried there. Uniquely, the pews in St. George's were permanently installed, rendering them immovable by hospital orderlies or Union soldiers. Some of the pews in other churches in town were cut up and used as headboards for grave sites. As well, 3 Tiffany stained glass windows are set in the church walls. The church was damaged in the Union bombardment of 1862 and was used as a hospital during the campaigns of 1862, 1863, and 1864. The church remained in service for both Union and Confederate soldiers, depending upon who occupied the town during the war. During the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862, one wounded Northerner described what he saw outside the building along the stairs. Dead soldiers, piled on either side as high as the top step, and the fence hanging full of belts, cartridge boxes, canteens, and haversacks. The fence and steps are the originals, but it is what has been seen inside the church, dating back to 1858, that interests most ghost hunters. The original 1858 story found in Virginia Ghosts by Marguerite DuPont Lee relates that a Miss Ella McCarty was a singer in the choir of St. George's. She had arrived at the church one night with a gentleman and found that they were early. Only the organist was present. The church was still dark, lit only by one candle in the choir loft, then located over the vestibule. The 2 men left Miss McCarty sitting in the church while they looked for more candles. As she sat, her eyes became more accustomed to the dark. She saw a female figure appearing to be dressed all in white with a veil over her face, kneeling at the rail in front of the church, apparently in prayer. Within a short time, the woman in white arose, and then, almost as if she were floating, turned to face Miss McCarty. She looked at her with a forlorn, desperate expression. Miss McCarty began to speak to the woman, and then she vanished. It is remarkable to find a ghost story in a Civil War town that predates the war. More common are those more recent, such as this one from the current century. A young woman was in the church and went into the restroom. From inside one of the stalls, she heard the door to the restroom open, and then the door to the next stall opened. Moments later, when she was leaving, she began to realize something was strange. Although she had heard someone walk into the restroom, move across the floor, and open the stall door, she heard no one leave, and there was no one in the room with her. Cautiously, she pushed the stall door open and realized that she had been alone in the room. According to the local police, their canine dogs are especially nervous inside and outside of the church. The dogs especially react at the door to the balcony. According to one officer, there aren't too many police officers who haven't had an experience in St. George's. Police officers will check the doors at night to make sure they are locked, and they are. An hour or so later they'll check again, and they will be unlocked. Officers will hear footsteps walking through the sanctuary when there is no one visible, and they will hear the benches creaking as if someone was sitting in them. The caretaker was working in the cemetery and felt someone come up behind him and touch him on the shoulder, but when he turned around to see what the person wanted, no one was there. One night, a rookie and a seasoned officer were patrolling together. They stopped at St. George's for a second time to make sure the doors were locked. The rookie said, "I'll handle this," and walked from the car to the door. He tried opening the door, which had been locked the first time they visited the church, and it was unlocked. The rookie waved for the officer to stay in the car, indicating that he would enter the church and make sure everything was in order, and then secure the building. The other officer waved his consent. 5 minutes passed, and then 10 minutes passed. After 20 minutes, the seasoned officer was concerned. Just as he was about to get out of the car, the rookie exited the church, locked the door behind him, and hopped back into the car. "Everything okay?" asked the veteran officer. "Yep. Checked all the doors and the rooms, even the weird room where everything is painted red." The veteran officer was silent and waited until a few days later to tell the rookie, "There is no red room in St. George's." The Chimneys. The Chimneys, a large historic building on the corner of Caroline and Charlotte Streets, was built around 1770 by an immigrant Scottish merchant, John Glassell. Loyal to the crown when the Revolution broke out, he left his property to his brother and returned to Scotland. The property has since changed hands many times and has assumed many reincarnations since then. Ghosts at the Chimneys are nothing new. Although some of the stories predate the Civil War, Mr. Brodie Herndon, who owned the house in the mid-19th century, contended that the house was haunted. Some of the paranormal events he recorded continue to this day, such as doorknobs being turned by invisible hands and doors opening by themselves. Apparently in Mr. Brodie's time, a woman saw her uncle standing in one of the rooms across the hall. By the time she entered the room, it was empty. This apparition was a harbinger, because her uncle died 3 days later. Apparently, one of the early occupants played the harp in the parlor, for it is from that area that the sweet strains of a phantom harp are heard upon occasion, playing a melody many decades removed from the list of popular songs. Sometimes the refrain is accompanied by a ghostly singer. Years after the harp and its player left, some occupants of the house brought a piano. One evening, a young woman sat down and began to accompany herself on the piano. She heard the front door open and close. She was surprised to hear footsteps approach. She knew there were guests out front, so when she asked the person, obviously trying to frighten her, to identify himself, the only answer was plodding footsteps, which by now had reached the doorway. She turned apprehensively toward the sound, but as the footfalls entered the room and approached her, she could see no one. Her piano recital suddenly came to an end when someone, quite invisible, sat down on the piano bench next to her and placed an unseen, icy hand upon her shoulder. One particular night, when the Chimneys was still a residence, a woman was awakened by a chill in the room. The chill grew perceptibly colder as she approached her youngest son's bedroom. She took a blanket from the closet and entered his room. To her astonishment, there was another male child apparently asleep in the bed next to her son. She could not identify him because his face was half covered with the sheet, but she assumed that perhaps her sleeping husband had invited one of the neighbor boys to spend the night. She covered the two and went back to bed herself. The next morning, when her husband awakened, she asked who the boy was who he had invited to spend the night with their son. She was met with an incredulous look and the affirmation that he had not invited anyone to spend the night. At that moment, her son came down for breakfast by himself and confirmed that indeed he had slept alone that night, and while that woman's original mission was to cover her son to ward off the cold, that night, at least in the rest of the house, it had been overly warm. A quick examination of her son's bed revealed to the woman that only one living child, had spent the night there in that room. Auditory apparitions, the most common kind, also occur here. The sound of china crashing to the floor is heard, but upon inspection of the room, nothing is amiss. Heavy footsteps are detected in the hall when no one is there. Doors are heard slamming. Occasionally, someone will see a rocking chair start moving back and forth with no one seated in it. One of the owners of a restaurant that was located in the house would come in at 4 a.m. to do his preparation for breakfast. The sound of silverware falling on the floor, with no actual silverware apparent anywhere, was frequent, and he had to holler at the ghost to leave him alone because he had work to do. The ruckus abruptly stopped. Some of the more recent activity involves child ghosts. There is the rumor of a little boy who fell from the balcony to his death many years ago. He also apparently doesn't like a certain door upstairs to be closed, because as often as they close it and leave for the night, the next morning the door is open. A little girl also walks the floors upstairs and is seen to vanish, as well as the apparition of a grown woman. Nicodemus. The stories about the famous Underground Railroad, that clandestine matrix of people, routes, and safe houses for runaway slaves in antebellum America, are as mysterious as they are romantic. Most of what we know about the system of transferring slaves from slaveholding states to freedom comes after the Civil War, since harboring escaped slaves throughout most of the American history was a crime, and those involved were reluctant to speak about it. In spite of that, the Virginian Abolition Society was formed in the 1780s. That's right, the Virginian Abolition Society. So much for all the evil Southern slaveholders. As a matter of fact, only about 7% of all Southerners owned slaves, which makes one wonder why some 18-year-old Southern boy whose family owned no slaves would sign up to fight in the Civil War and possibly die for the rich man on the plantation to keep his slaves. He wouldn't and wasn't fighting just for slavery. American history is never as simple as some would make it. Legislators, representing slaveholders, fought to keep the institution. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, rights to slaves as property, became constitutional. Regardless, by 1830, the Underground Railroad was in full operation in both the North and the South. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made it a violation of federal law to assist escaping slaves, and slaves were forced to be returned to their masters, inflicting heavy fines and jail terms upon those aiding slaves' escape. Railroad terminology was used to throw off slave catchers. Safe houses were depots or stations located one night's walk apart. Conductors were guides to escaping slaves. Agents offered their homes as day shelter for escapees, and superintendents controlled the operations in the entire state. During the day, slaves were hidden in barns, beneath floorboards, in false rooms within the cockpits of mills, and down in damp cellars. They often waited for days for forged documents of passage to arrive. Nighttime escapes were made on foot in false bottoms in wagons, on top of railroad cars, and by canoe, schooner, or steamer. The Chesapeake Bay was sought because of its access to the north, so the waterways draining into the bay, such as the Rappahannock, were desired routes. Indeed, several maps of the routes of the escapees on the Underground Railroad show Fredericksburg in the center. At this writing, there is no documented evidence that the chimney was ever used as a depot on the Underground Railroad. There is, however, evidence from the other world that someone desperate to escape remained in the cellar of the building far too long. This is a story of two kinds of escape, one from slavery, the other from death. On the evening of April 21st, 2006, Julie Pellegrino, the spirit liaison I often use during paranormal investigations, explored the chimneys, along with several others interested in the paranormal history of the building. After getting her impressions of several of the rooms, including the strong presence of a seafarer, Julie descended into the cellar. The cellar of the chimneys is currently used as a storage area for the businesses in the building. Julie approached the main area of the cellar and commented, "I feel like I can't leave, but I'm not a prisoner and I'm not locked in." Channeling is a psychic phenomena where mediums become conduits for the deceased, feeling, moving, and speaking as if they were the dead people. Julie was later asked if she was channeling someone dead from the past, and she answered no, that she was merely repeating verbatim what she was hearing in the cellar that night. According to my wife Carol, who accompanied her into the cellar, after passing through the door into the room, Julie received the name Nicodemus. Julie's commentary went on as follows. "I don't know where I am. Came with others. They got papers. They left. Can't leave without papers. Miss Hattie brings papers. Can't read, can't write. Don't know what's in the papers. Need papers to leave. Others come. Get papers. Leave. Don't understand." Julie interjects at this point that she sensed that there was something wrong with his hand, that his hand was crippled or injured in some way. When he speaks again, Julie points to some objects piled in the corner. "I work, back strong. I carry things. I carry that. I work. Need papers. Don't understand. People in house don't know I hear." Carol asks Julie if his name is Nicodemus. "No, just what they call me. Hattie, not her name, just what they call her. Hear music, must be quiet, dark. Miss Hattie's paper brings. More come. They got papers. Left, said they'd come back for me. Never came. Music stopped. Quiet. Scared can't leave." Julie suddenly says that she smelled smoke and was on the verge of tears at this point. She also had the sense that he had died there in the cellar. Julie's olfactory impression of a fire is interesting because the records show that in 1799, a huge fire destroyed much of the neighborhood near the chimneys. It was rebuilt but burned again in 1823. This may give us a clue as to which approximate period Julie was tapping into. Carol called me into the cellar and Julie asked me to attempt to get some EVP. My technique is to ask a question pertinent to the past into a digital recorder, then pause, with the recorder set on voice activation. In complete silence, the machine begins to record. One other thing. I have never considered myself sensitive in any way to paranormal effects. Perhaps it is because I was trained as a writer to be objective. Perhaps it says something about the fact that we're all different, with different sensitivities. Some of us are born with sharper hearing or better eyesight than others. Possibly it is the same with sensitivities to ghosts. Some people are not. I think I fall into the latter category. My mind was changed in a few short minutes. 2 sessions were attempted. The first session yielded rough growling, staccato answers to my questions. Prior to the second session, Julie recommended that I tell Nicodemus that he could go now, that he didn't need his papers, and that he didn't need to wait for Hattie. I did just that. As I stood there in the darkened cellar in my short-sleeved shirt, I felt an extremely cold spot touch my arm and remained there for about 5 seconds. Then it was replaced by a hot sensation, then it returned to regular temperature. The rest of my body was normal temperature. After the session, I mentioned this to Julie. "That was Nicodemus," she said. She too had felt him leave the cellar. He passed between us. The Kenmore Inn. The Kenmore Inn was built in 1793. George Washington, no doubt, spent some time there. Fielding Lewis once owned the property, and Lewis most certainly would have entertained his brother-in-law, George. Lewis may have lived in the building while construction of Kenmore Plantation was going on. During the Civil War, Union soldiers used the basement as stalls for their horses. There's a garage that has been remodeled into a casual dining area, but it was used as a hospital during the battle. Employees have found bullets and buttons in the yard, as well as a whiskey flask and some vertebra that might be human. There's a great deal of paranormal activity at the Kenmore. Perhaps the unsettled spirits of the wounded who passed away at the inn during the conflict. On Halloween 2005, one of the managers of the Kenmore, Gretchen, and 2 of the waitstaff were standing in the front hallway at the main entrance where there are 2 chandeliers. They were talking, and Gretchen happened to mention something about ghosts. Just at that moment, the light in the chandelier overhead flashed. They all looked at each other incredulously and moved out of the room. About 5 minutes later, they were talking again, mentioning the flashing light that seemed kind of odd. Gretchen mentioned the word ghost again, and the same chandelier flashed. It had never flashed before, and hasn't since. Of course, Gretchen admitted that she refuses to use the word ghost in the hallway since the weird occurrence. Before she started working at the Kenmore, Gretchen visited Fredericksburg as a tourist. One night she was staying in room 208. She had gone to bed, but was awakened at 3 a.m. by the sound of something very large and heavy being dragged down the hall past her room. It passed her room, but didn't go down the stairs. At first she thought maybe it was a guest who had had an argument with a roommate and was leaving in the middle of the night. However, it didn't sound at all like wheeled luggage rolling down the hall, but more like something being dragged, and upon checking the next morning she found out that no one had left the Kenmore in the middle of the night. She later stayed in room 107 downstairs. She was in the bathroom and went out to the bed to get something from her suitcase. When she went back into the bathroom, the light had been turned off. She now rents that room out to guests who report that the medicine cabinet door pops open often and the bathroom door will not stay closed, even when the door is latched. In room 207, she hung an old picture on the wall above the commode, on a nail driven into plaster. A week later, a guest had reported that the picture had fallen off the wall. She never had any pictures fall off the walls because they're very securely nailed into the plaster. She went and nailed it back in. About a month later, it fell off again. The strange thing is that it never breaks, neither glass nor frame. It's almost as if someone gently removes it from the wall, nail and all, and places the picture on the floor. Periodically, state inspectors have come to check the kitchen and the public restrooms. A female inspector once asked to see the men's room. The manager said, "Go ahead, there's no one here now." The inspector went back downstairs and heard the water running in the men's room. She came back upstairs to tell the manager, but the manager said, "That's impossible. I'm the only one here. Go inside." So the inspector opened the door, and a huge cloud of what she described as steam came pouring out. She saw that the hot water was on, and as hard as it could go. But everyone in the Kenmore knows that the water down in the basement never gets hot enough to produce steam, and certainly not enough steam to create a man-sized cloud of mist. One must wonder if it was rather paranormal mist that the inspector witnessed. The same inspector was under the dishwashing sink. She thought she'd put her hand in the water because it felt so cold. Upon reflection, she said it felt like someone had put a cold hand right on top of hers. Of course, there was no water and no one, at least no one visible, lying beneath the sink with icy cold hands. Also, periodically, Gretchen will go downstairs to the kitchen, and the gas burners on the stove will be turned on full blast. Room 203, which is actually 2 adjoining rooms, had 2 different guests at 2 different times say that they felt like someone was stroking their hair. A woman was sleeping in the front room and her 2 children in the back room in the twin beds. She woke up in the middle of the night and thought someone was sitting on her bed, perhaps one of her children. But when she looked up, she saw nothing. She went to see if one of her children had gotten up, but they were both still asleep. During the winter of 2005 and 6, Gretchen was walking down the handicap ramp to get some wood for a guest's fireplace. The lights on the side of the building were light-sensitive and had never worked. She hit a patch of black ice on the ramp and fell flat on her back. So she got the wood and, under her breath, cursed out the owner because he hadn't fixed the lights. The next night she went out to get wood and the light over the ramp was working. It has never worked again. She asked around if anyone had flipped a switch or anything. All said no. One wonders if the original owner of the building heard her and wanted to ensure her safety the second time. In the fine dining room, 2 of the candelabra fixtures in one of the chandeliers will periodically flicker. These are not the same chandeliers in the hallway that flashed. The lights will go for months and nothing will happen. Then they will flicker again. Then in May 2006, Gretchen heard something that she had never heard before in the Kenmore. Disembodied voices. The first was a very deep male voice, saying 4 or 5 words, coming from near the floor by room 208. Then she heard a woman's voice emanating from the stairwell in the kitchen leading to the first floor. She could not understand the words, but she was sure he was female. Several times, Gretchen has used the back room as her own bedroom. She referred to the noises that the older heating pipes make when the heat kicks on, kind of like a banging metal on metal sound. She heard that sound coming from the floor of that room. Clanking sounds, every night, coming from the floor. The room, however, is unheated, and there are no pipes existing below the floor to make that sound. The end.